Link TV, connecting you to the world. Link TV is viewer supported. Watch more at linktv.org.
Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Rival protests held at New York Ground Zero mosque site. PLO accuses Netanyahu of sabotaging direct peace talks. And the UN describes the humanitarian situation in Pakistan as critical. Mosaic World News from the Middle East begins now.
الرئيس الفلسطيني محمود عباس خطابات إلى الرئيسين الأمريكي والروسي.
In a speech directed to the US and Russian presidents, the UN Secretary General and the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said that the direct talks must be based on what he referred to as references of negotiations. Among them are UN resolutions, the Roadmap for Peace, the Arab Peace Initiative, as well as the Madrid Conference. Meanwhile, the Arab League expressed concerns over Israel's position regarding the basis for the resumption of direct talks with the Palestinians. The group said in a statement that Washington, which called for direct talks on the basis of the Quartet's principles, has a large historical responsibility as sponsor of the negotiations. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the Palestinians must recognize Israel as a Jewish state before the launch of direct talks set on September 2nd. Sharouk Assad reports from Jerusalem.
The Israeli Prime Minister will preside over the direct talks 20 months after their suspension. The talks will launch on shaky ground amidst the notable disagreement on principles. Speaking before senior members of his cabinet, Netanyahu set the terms for negotiations, with the security concern topping his list of priorities. The Israeli Prime Minister said that the Palestinians must recognize Israel as a national state of the Jewish people.
First, we must take unequivocal and practical security arrangements on the ground. Second, we must preserve Israel as a national state of the Jewish people. This means resolving the right of return within the borders of the Palestinian state.
We will not recognize Israel as a Jewish state under any circumstances, not now, not in the future. Netanyahu's remarks are nothing more than an attempt to impede the negotiations before they are launched. It's definitely a shaky start.
The Palestinians are heading to the direct talks on the basis of the Quartet's principles, which have not openly called for a settlement freeze. The Quartet's statement called on both sides to abide by previous resolutions, which include the settlement freeze and the 1967 borderline.
The entire world is now watching. The international community was the one to issue the Quartet's statement, which we accepted. President Abu Mazen advised the Americans that in the event Israel continues to build settlements after September 26th, we will not take part in the direct talks.
Netanyahu is saying that the demarcation of borders will be based on Israel's need for security. His country will not freeze its settlement activities, and the goal is to reach a preliminary agreement. In contrast, the Palestinians want to resolve all their final status issues, including Jerusalem and the refugees. Netanyahu has not publicly accepted the Quartet's statement. He only accepted an invitation from the U.S. Secretary of State to attend direct talks without preconditions. The points of disagreement are dominating the agenda of the Palestinian-Israel talks. One of the practical tests for such talks may crystallize on September 26th, which Israel sets as a deadline for its partial settlement freeze, a deadline that Israel will not likely extend. Meanwhile, the majority of the Israeli public believes that Netanyahu wants to go to the direct talks for one reason, which is security.
Well, ahead of next week's launch of direct peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians, PA President Mahmoud Abbas has fired off letters to U.S. President Barack Obama, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, and EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton. In those letters, Abbas repeats the threat issued over the weekend by Chief Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat and warns that renewed Israeli construction in the settlements when the building moratorium runs out would bring the negotiations to a screeching halt. Abbas writes, quote, "It's impossible to conduct negotiations alongside settlement construction." No response from Prime Minister Netanyahu, who left today with his family for a brief vacation up north. Jewish residents in Judea and Samaria are urging Prime Minister Netanyahu not to renew the building moratorium in the West Bank when it expires September 26th. West Bank settlers claim the freeze has contributed nothing to peace, but has hurt young families in need of affordable housing.
I think they should lift the ban because we do everything to help the Palestinians and everything, and it doesn't help us, so we might as well just carry on and do and please ourselves and worry about ourselves. And if there are peace, see what happens.
You know, history proves that this isn't what's going to solve the problem. There's something very historical and very deep that's going on between us and the Arabs, and I don't think that not building another house is what's going to solve the problem.
The West Bank's northern Aghwar region, known as the Jordan Valley, is witnessing an unprecedented campaign aimed at Judifying the Palestinian territories. Israel continues to confiscate and annex the Aghwar territory in order to expand the settlements and seize control of all vital installations in the region, which is home to the largest underground aquifer in occupied Palestine.
It's a territory stretching over hundreds of square kilometers and was once an evergreen territory. However, today the territory is being overrun by dozens of Israeli settlement outposts that seem to be expanding day by day. The Palestinian residents of Aghwar, also known as the Northern Aghwar Territory, have expressed fear over losing what remains of their land. The Northern Aghwar region, which makes up 1/4 of the West Bank's total area, is home to nearly 47% of underground Palestinian water resources. Over the past decades, the occupation entity has launched a series of campaigns aimed at expelling Palestinians from the Aghwar region. However, Israel has intensified its Judification campaign in recent years in an attempt to seize full control of the Aghwar region. Palestinian residents continue to receive home demolition notices on a daily basis, under military and security pretexts. The aim is to force Palestinian residents out of their homes, confiscate their land, and appropriate their agricultural and water resources. The total area of Aghwar, including the dozens of villages and dwellings in the valley, stands at 1,303 square kilometers, with nearly 70% falling under Israeli control. Most of the confiscated land is used for settlements and military training camps. In addition, Israel has full control over the region's natural resources, including its underground aquifer. The Aghwar region is slowly dying due to the Judification campaign launched by the Israeli authorities. Aghwar residents don't have access to water, electricity, or public services, as the occupation authorities prevent the launch of any development projects in the region. According to the latest figures, nearly 10,000 Israeli settlers live in the northern Aghwar region, distributed over 12 settlements. The settlers' consumption of water is 5 times larger than that of their Palestinian counterparts. The settlers have full control of water resources in the region, which is often referred to by the Israeli entity as the Eastern Protective Wall. In contrast, Palestinians are denied access to water resources. Many Palestinian water wells have dried up or were drained by the occupation authorities. Israel doesn't allow Palestinians to restore or expand old water wells or dig new ones. Nearly 50% of Aghwar's land is being farmed, accounting for 60% of the total Palestinian vegetable production, 40% of its citric, and 100% of its banana production. The Israeli goal is to force Palestinians out of their homes and lands in order to confiscate and annex the region. Aghwar accounts for nearly 25% of the West Bank's total area, stretching from the Dead Sea region to the northern West Bank region. Jericho and Aouja are currently under the security control of the Palestinian Authority. The rest of the Aghwar territory is referred to as Area A and Area G under the terms of the Oslo Agreement. Nearly 90% of this territory falls under Zionist security control.
Dozens of supporters and opponents of plans to build a mosque and an Islamic cultural center near the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center have staged rival protests in New York City.
تظاهرات لأنصار بناء مسجد بالقرب من موقع تفجيرات 11 من سبتمبر في
Supporters and opponents of plans to build a mosque near the site of the September 11th attacks have staged peaceful rival protests in New York City.
دون أن يشد أي منهما جمهورا كبيرا.
Though small in scale, the street protests reflect a national debate over a proposed plan to build an Islamic cultural center, including a mosque, on private land near the memorial site of the September 11th attacks nearly 9 years ago.
قبل 9 سنوات موضع نقاش في الأسابيع الأخيرة. وكان الرئيس الأمريكي أوباما
U.S. President Barack Obama's support for the proposed mosque has stirred uproar, prompting the president to clarify his position, saying it's a matter of principle.
هي مسألة مبادئ. في هذه الأثناء وفي إطار جولة له في منطقة الخليج وصل فيصل عبد الرؤوف.
Meanwhile, Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, who is leading the development of the proposed mosque in New York City, has arrived in the Gulf region on a Mideast tour funded by the U.S. State Department as part of a campaign to spread the culture of tolerance. Speaking during iftar at a gathering in the U.S. Embassy in Manama, Sheikh Abdul Rauf explained the reasons behind building the mosque on this particular site.
المسجد في هذا الموقع والمطالب التي ينادي بها.
We have to strengthen our efforts. All of us have to work in this together.
We have to strengthen our efforts, and all of us must work in this together. I would like to commend President Obama's supportive stance on the project. I would also like to commend Mayor Bloomberg and anyone taking the same position.
ومن المنتظر أن يكمل الشيخ
Sheikh Abdul Rauf is expected to extend his tours to other Mideast countries, including the UAE and Qatar, in order to explain the U.S. stance on the proposed mosque.
قتل جنديان من القوات الدولية العاملة في أفغانستان أحدهما أمريكي.
2 NATO soldiers, among them 1 American, were killed in double blasts by explosive devices in the northern and southern parts of the country. This brings the death toll of the NATO soldiers this month to 44, including 29 Americans. The death of the 2 soldiers came after 4 American soldiers were killed yesterday in intense combat in the eastern and southern parts of Afghanistan.
قتال شديد تشهده المناطق الشرقية والجنوبية من البلاد. ولا نزال في أفغانستان فقد أكد الجنرال ديفيد بيتريوس القائد الأمريكي للقوات.
The top commander of the U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, General David Petraeus, affirmed that his troops gained momentum over the Taliban in a number of regions. But he expects fierce battles in other regions in order to reverse the momentum from the Taliban. In an interview on BBC, the U.S. commander reaffirmed that the scheduled withdrawal date for the U.S. troops in July 2011 is at stake due to the conditions on the ground.
The new top commander of the NATO forces in Afghanistan, General David Petraeus, seems more confident every day about achieving victory in Afghanistan. He reiterated to the BBC that his forces have taken the momentum from the Taliban in a number of areas, but he is not overly confident.
I think the reality is that
the momentum that the Taliban had established over the course of recent years has been reversed in many areas of the country and will be reversed in other areas as well. And that's not enough. You not only have to reverse the momentum, you have to take away the sanctuaries and safe havens that the Taliban have been able to establish over the course of those years, that they enjoy the momentum. That's going to entail tough fighting.
The US commander was not assertive in his talk about the scheduled date for the US troops to withdraw from Afghanistan, which was set by the US President Barack Obama to be in July 2011.
That's a date when a process begins.
That's a date when a process begins, nothing more, nothing less. It's not a date when the American forces begin an exodus and look for the exit and the light to turn off on the way out of the room. It's a date when a process of transition of some tasks to some Afghan forces in those areas where the conditions allow it, and at a pace allowed by the conditions. That's what begins it.
وحذر قادة عسكريون من أن الحرب ستزداد صعوبة هذا العام مع مضي القوات.
The military commander warned that the war will be more difficult this year when the forces proceed to carry out the plan to take over the Taliban strongholds in the south. July was one of the bloodiest months for the US Army in this war since it started 9 years ago. Before that, June was the bloodiest month for the NATO forces. Petraeus, who replaced General Stanley McChrystal about a month ago, commands 150,000 soldiers in US and NATO forces.
150,000 جندي من القوات الأمريكية وقوات حلف شمال الأطلسي. وكان الرئيس الأمريكي قد تعهد خلال إعلانه.
The US President promised in his announcement of the US strategy for the war in December 2009 to send 30,000 additional US soldiers to Afghanistan. Obama is also determined to review his Afghanistan strategy after the congressional elections in November.
في نوفمبر تشرين الثاني. ورغم مساندة الكونغرس لخطط أوباما لتعزيز.
Despite Congress's support to Obama's plan of strengthening the forces, surveys show that public opinion is still doubtful about the war and its feasibility. Ashraf Negi, BBC.
Afghanistan blames its Western allies for most of the corruption in the war-torn country. Presidential spokesman Omar Wahid says Afghanistan's foreign partners have paved the grounds for the creation of economic mafias. He says security deals between U.S.-led forces and private security firms operating in Afghanistan topped the corrupt contracts. Omar also described the level of graft in the Afghan government as small compared to the extent of corruption in the Western contract system. Afghanistan is under intense foreign pressure to end widespread corruption in the country. At least 3 U.S.-led soldiers have been killed in clashes with Taliban across Afghanistan. The militants attacked a Hungarian convoy in northern areas near Mazar-e-Sharif overnight Monday. Hungary's defense ministry has confirmed the attack and said it left 1 soldier dead and 3 others wounded. One of the wounded soldiers is in critical condition. Meanwhile, 2 U.S. soldiers have been killed in southeastern Paktia province. They were killed in a Taliban ambush against a joint patrol unit of U.S.-Afghan forces.
U.S. President Barack Obama's new troop surge to Afghanistan appears to be a desperate attempt to get out of the crisis NATO troops are in.
The total number of coalition deaths is over 2,000 since the war began in 2001. This is really shocking.
According to the latest figures by NATO, over 450 coalition troops have been killed in Afghanistan this year, and the number is also rising for the U.S. casualties. To reverse the course, the U.S. and NATO are sending more troops. But the Russian ambassador to Afghanistan said recently that the coalition is repeating mistakes made by the Soviet Union. Ambassador Andrei Vitasian, when asked about lessons learned by the Russians during their own Afghan war, replied that the strategy of occupying key towns and cities without attempting to increase influence in the countryside is a key error that the US-led forces are now repeating.
Sending 30,000 more US troops will not make the situation better. They cannot win this war even if they send millions of troops.
Kandahar province is now the next target. US troops will begin an offensive here next month. The plan is to flush out the Taliban, but many here believe the new strategy will fail. The rising numbers of US and NATO casualties plus the civilian deaths have raised further questions about the chances of the US-led forces mission succeeding. The crisis and the splits at the top of the US and British political and military establishments are also proof of the disaster of the Afghan war. Some countries, such as Germany and France, are refusing to commit more troops, and Canada and others are already following withdrawal plans. In other words, the US and Britain look ever more isolated in a war which is unwinnable by any standards. Faiz Khurshid, Press TV, Kabul.
Meanwhile, a NATO raid in Afghanistan's northern Kunduz province has left 6 civilians dead and 11 more injured. Provincial officials say the fatalities include a woman and a child. They say NATO forces took 4 other civilians with them. The Western military alliance is already under fire over the rising civilian death toll in that country. The UN says more than 1,200 Afghan civilians were killed during the first half of 2010. A bomb explosion in northwestern Pakistan has killed at least 22 people. A former lawmaker was among those killed in the attack. Police say dozens of others were injured. The death toll is expected to rise as many of the injured are in critical condition. The explosion happened in a religious school and mosque in Wana town in the South Waziristan region. Officials say about 100 people were in the area when the blast happened.
The dire situation has not eased for the millions of Pakistanis affected by the floods, which have been inundating the country for about a month.
New waves of flooding have terrified people and forced more residents in southern Pakistan to flee their homes in extreme, brutal conditions during Ramadan. More than 4 million people have no shelter. The UN Secretary General described the catastrophe in Pakistan as a slow-motion tsunami.
Al Jazeera correspondent Ahmed Barakat tells us about the suffering that the flood victims are enduring.
The water level of the Indus River rises at one time and falls at another, and the level of alert in the village near the river rises and falls with it. The mud barrier that the residents of the villages near Shahbad relied on for protection has collapsed. This has led to a new large-scale wave of migration from these areas to other places. When the refugee camps became too full to hold more people, hundreds of families fled to stay in colleges and schools in poor condition. Perhaps the hardest thing that these people are suffering from is the psychological impact due to displacement and lost income. Both adults and children are worried.
We are suffering from diseases, especially malaria and depression. There are no doctors from the government, and the medicines are useless. Because we're poor, the hospitals don't pay us any attention.
The hospitals in Sukkur are crowded with patients of various ages. Children have it the worst. Millions of them are suffering from dehydration, malnutrition, and diseases caused by contaminated water, in addition to the high temperature and the harsh living conditions. The doctors say that the matter is beyond their capability, and the hospitals are no longer able to hold the increasing number of patients.
You hospitalize them. We can't hospitalize so many patients.
We hospitalize them. We can't hospitalize so many patients. Every day I treat 30 to 40 children suffering from stomach diseases. During the past 24 hours, we've received more than 100 children with diarrhea, and we can treat no more than that.
Severe diarrhea has killed dozens of children before they could even reach the hospitals. Those who were checked in 1 or 2 days ago are still lying in bed waiting to be treated. Everyone is complaining about their deteriorating health conditions. The receding floods and the reconstruction of buildings are only a matter of time. But experts say that the most difficult task is to rehabilitate these patients who are suffering from all kinds of problems. Ahmed Barakat, Al Jazeera, Sukkur, Sindh region.
As part of our series, Your Day in Ramadan, we will introduce you today to a Palestinian family who works together to make bread and numerous types of Ramadan pastries. Abdul Hafiz Jawan has the details.
صباح رمضاني في مخبز البيت العربي.
This is the scene of a Ramadan morning in a family bakery. The children are working together to prepare shirak bread. The mother is preparing the dough in anticipation of a long day. As for the father, he's burning firewood and setting up the fire, announcing the beginning of a Ramadan day for the Abu Muhammad family.
We thank God, even though it's hot and even hotter in here. If you don't work hard, you don't appreciate the sweet things.
علم أبو محمد العائلة بأكملها مهنته هذه.
Abu Muhammad taught his family his bread-making skill. His wife, sons and daughters work together as one. Throughout the day, they move in between the dough, fire and bread to serve their customers and sell various types of bread. The parents buy and prepare the food, then place it in the wood-fired oven to be later served in a delicious iftar meal.
We all work together, my boys and girls. Sometimes they get upset with each other and get frustrated. They slap each other around. You know what I mean? Even though they argue sometimes, they laugh a lot too. Life is beautiful with all its components. Sadness, sweetness, satisfaction. Thank God, we're very happy together.
Who's the boss here? Who's in charge?
The problem is that when it comes to money, everybody is the boss.
They give me a hard time, and I give them a hard time too. I can't help it. There are arguments and happy moments. I get upset from time to time, but I put up with it.
The
family overcomes the difficulties of fasting in the scorching heat through the joy of collective work and their family bond. They work until it's time for dusk prayer, when Abu Muhammad washes himself and the last customer leaves his bakery carrying delicious traditional bread made in the wood-fired oven. Abdul Hafith Chouan, Al Arabiya, the Palestinian Territories.
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible from support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news. Read our blog. Get transcripts of past shows and more at linktv.org/mosaic.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs, programs which connect you to the world.